So once again, welcome everyone after having this very brief technical introduction. So just to remind those of you that will watch our webinar at YouTube channel, webinar is entitled European Responses to the 2020 Forced Migration from Ukraine. And we are referring to the newly published special issue of the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. It was titled Restrictive, Liberal, Selective or Universal, a cross-national analysis of European countries' policy responses to forced migration from Ukraine. It was co-edited by two great researchers that they are both with us, Vilde Hernes and Karolina Łukasiewicz. And the countries that were covered in the special issue papers include findings from Austria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Norway, Poland, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. It is also important to mention that the event that we have today is co-organized, as usual, by the Laboratory of Urban and Regional Migration Policies and Migration Policies Research Unit at the CMR, University of Warsaw, and the Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research at Oslo Metropolitan University. So now I would like to briefly present the speakers of today, and then we'll move to the core part of the meeting, and it will be moderated by my colleague Karolina. So we will start with a presentation by Vilde Hernes from Oslo Med, and she will introduce, in fact, the general framework of the whole special issue based on the introductory editorial from the paper she co-written with Karolina Łukasiewicz. Then it's Karolina Łukasiewicz that will discuss the case of Poland. It was co-developed by Andrzej Dierisejew from CMR UW and myself on behalf of SGH Warsaw School of Economics. The third contribution is the one by Mette Louise-Berg from University College London, Social Research Institute. She will discuss the UK's response, and her paper was co-written, co-developed with Laura Kasu and Silke Schomler. The next one is Nora Ratzmann. So the paper by the team from DESIM in Berlin about German response to the forced migration from Ukraine, and it was co-developed with Magdalena Nowicka and Markus Engler. The fifth presentation is by Sara Koik-Kalainen from the University of Eastern Finland and Oksana Shmulyar-Green, together with Joni Virkunen, Azmeri Fedush, and Svitlana Odinets. They were working on the case of the responses in Sweden and Finland. And finally, among the speakers today, we have once again, as the closing contribution, Vilde Hernes, and she will discuss Norway, Denmark, and Sweden responses as the Scandinavian perspective. And the paper was co-written with Asne Danielsen. In addition, among the contributions to the special issue, we had a team from Austria, from University of Vienna, including Tatiana Bocci, Yvonne Franz, and Yuri Kazepov. Unfortunately, they are not joining us today, but obviously you are encouraged also to look at their contribution to the special issue. So I hope on behalf of Karolina, Vilde, and myself, and all the co-authors that you will enjoy the meeting. That is a kind of guidance, what you can find in the special issue. And now I would like to give the floor to Karolina to moderate the following part.
Yes, so actually I just want to welcome everyone again, and we will start with the first paper that is introductory to our special issue and provides theoretical framework and overview of the articles in the special issue, and Vilde Hernes from Oslo Met will present it. Go ahead, Vilde.
Yes.
Okay, do you see everything fine and hear me fine?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Yes, okay, perfect. So Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine led to the most extensive forced displacement in Europe since World War II. So the European response was initially portrayed as rather unified and liberal, exemplified by the EU's activation of the Temporary Protection Directive. However, how accurate is this narrative, and how have the responses developed over time? So this is the main question that we ask in this special issue, and it's my pleasure to introduce the introduction article today and the overall design of the special issue. So first of all, the special issue includes this introduction that I will present now, which presents a new framework and the synthesizing analysis across the 8 countries included. And then it follows with 6 individual and comparative articles investigating these 8 European countries, as mentioned by Marta earlier. So I'm not going to get into the differences between these countries, but the SI includes countries that differ on very important contextual factors, such as being federal or unitary states. They have different welfare regimes. Their alliance to the EU or the Schengen or the common European asylum system differ, and they have different population sizes. Also, both historically and particularly after 2022, with the arrivals of forced migrants from Ukraine, we also see that they differ substantially when it comes to how many arrivals they have received relative to their population. So this map shows that the darker the green color, the more people arrivals you had from Ukraine compared to your population. And you see that there are very large differences across countries. So all of these differences makes it a very interesting case to compare the European responses across countries. So in the introduction article, we start a little bit by discussing how forced migrants from Ukraine constitute a new group or not in that regard as forced migrants in some aspects. So as probably everybody know, most importantly, we saw the introduction of the EU TPD that provided this immediate protection and rights to this group of migrants. So, but we also saw that in other countries that is included in this special issue, such as Denmark, Norway, and the UK, also introduced national variants of collective temporary protection or particular visa schemes in the case of UK, which had the common trait that it was a rapid access to protection and it included certain minimum rights. But it also included this very temporary perspective as a rapid solution. Other more distinctive features of this particular groups that makes it interesting to study this as an academic case is, of course, first and foremost, the unprecedented number of arrivals, both in scale and pace that happened after 2022. But it's also interesting because many countries had a large Ukrainian diaspora before 2022. So this can also affect the dynamic of the policy development and reception. Additionally, we see that it's a very different group competition when we compare Ukrainians who fled to European countries and many other groups of protection seekers when it comes to the gender balance, the age, the education level, and related to the diaspora, the prior network they had in these countries. So all of these aspects make it interesting to see how the policy development has been in the European countries, how it differed from previous influxes, and how it differs across countries. So this leads us to our 2 main research questions in the introduction article and the overall SI special issue question. That is, how unified has the response of European countries really been? And the second one is, how has this developed with the protracted war? And the time scope of these analyses are more or less up to 3 years after February 2022. So we also see for a look and compare the development over time. So To do such a comparative analysis, we have, through this special issue, developed a new analytical framework to enable cross-cutting and synthesizing analysis. So based on two of the main debates in the current integration and migration literature, we look at number one, whether policies are becoming more restrictive or liberal. So this is one of the main dimensions and debates in the migration literature for several decades now. However, more recent studies has also challenged this the dichotomous liberal restrictive dimension by arguing that countries may have policies that are more or less selective or universal for migrants, differentiating rights between either migrants and citizens, different groups of migrants, or, for example, in our case that we study, between forced migrants from Ukraine and other groups of protection seekers. So combined, these two dimensions lead us to the analytical framework that we present, the restrictive, liberal, selective, or universal policy framework, or for short, RELISU framework. So this is important to say that this framework is not supposed to be a quantitative index, but it's deliberately made rather general to make it possible to operationalize it and use it for different sub-areas of migrant policies. And I'm going to go through it a little bit with examples in a minute. But first, just to talk you through how you could use it more practically. So when you use the RELISU framework, you can first of all select the policy because it can be used in a different number of areas. For example, asylum, integration measures, settlement, permits, citizenship rules, for example. And then the second step is to select who are you comparing against each other. So you could either compare immigrants towards other citizens, between, for example, work rights of work migrants and family migrants, or as we do in this special issue, different types of protection seekers. And which level of comparison you want to be at this second step all depends on the research question, so it's possible to adapt. So then in the third step, you will classify the policies for the 2 or 3 groups that you compare on the restrictive liberal scale, and then determine whether the policies are universal, so meaning that they apply its similar policies to everyone, or if it's selective, that there are differentiated rights between the different groups that you compare. So to exemplify with the case that we have in this special issue, where we analyze different policies and rights for forced migrants from Ukraine versus other type of protection seekers and beneficiaries. So this first upper left square, where we have a restrictive and selective policy for Ukrainians, for example, that would be an example where other refugee groups were granted rights to language training or integration programs, but Ukrainians were excluded from such rights. On the other side, you could have liberal and selective policies for Ukrainian refugees, which would mean that Ukrainians would have specific rights to language courses and integration measures, but where other groups of protection seekers, for example, were not entitled to this. The third option is that you could have restrictive and universal policies. So in this case, there would be no rights of integration measures were granted to either Ukrainian forced migrants from Ukraine or other groups of protection beneficiaries. For example, that is no nationally regulated rights to integration measures. And the last example could be where you have a liberal and universal policies. So that would be cases where you have liberal rights to language training and integration programs, but where it is granted to all those who apply for protection, Ukrainian forced migrants and other groups as well. So this is how you could use this framework to classify different policies, more or less. So this was just an example using integration measures. So the synthesizing analysis, we strived for the introduction article not to just be a short summary, but also provide new synthesizing analysis that really cut across the different articles and let us gaze on what do we know when we have all of these 6 articles. So, of course, the details for all of the findings, you can get more in the presentations and in the articles as well. But our main conclusion is that we do not see a very unified response. So, except for the collective temporary permits that all countries did implement in some form or another, there are very few unified and common traits. So otherwise, what we find is highly diverging rights and obligations. We find very varying dynamics and developments over time. And there are very different national debates, whether this is politicized or not even talked about at all. So we conclude that this challenge, this initial narrative of a very unified and one-sided liberal response to the reception of Ukrainian refugees. Another interesting notion that we both in the discussions when we made this special issue in the research group is who are we comparing forced migrants from Ukraine to? So do we compare them to other protection seekers, asylum seekers, or do we compare their rights and obligations compared to other who are granted protection, such as refugees or those on subsidiary protection? And it's very interesting also to see that in the national debates, in the analysis, we see that different countries do compare them in the national debates to different groups. And this also affect the conclusions that each country come up with. But mainly we can say that when you compare Ukrainian refugees' rights to other asylum seekers, they have generally worse rights than better rights than asylum seekers, but they generally had worse rights when it came to comparing them to other protection beneficiaries, so those who were granted protection. Also, our analysis shows that we not only find very large cross-national differences, but also examples, for example, in Austria, Poland, and Germany, of very large regional rights. So that there are differences between where you ended up in the host country and what rights you get. For example, if you ended up in Vienna or a small city in the Austrian case. And more prominently, I would say that there are very many examples across the different countries of differences within the group of Ukrainian forced migrants. So depending on what time of arrival you had to the host country, your residence time in a host country, where in Ukraine you fled from, or your ethnic background, we see very different differentiated rights between subgroups of Ukrainians. And second to last, we also, when we analyze the development over time, we do see that the initial response was generally more liberal policies and open arms. But after now almost 4 years, but included in this analysis up to at least 3 years, we see that several countries now started introducing more restrictions on rights and liberties. And that this has been, and the general trend has been in a restrictive turn for those who had more liberal options in the beginning. So to conclude and look at the path forward based on our analysis, we can see now in the last year of analysis that there is a growing European war fatigue, and the consequences of that politically, we also see that there's a rising question of perhaps selective deservingness of who of the Ukrainians are deserving of protection and not, and for how long. And based on our analysis and other studies, we see that there are very bleak prospects for a very large-scale voluntary return. And for all the European countries, this will cause very huge dilemmas on what to do forward. And we also know that the EU has now proposed the countries, the European member states, to provide other permits for more permanent residency and to plan for more return options. But based on our analysis on the initial response and the first 3 years after the full-scale invasion, we see the probability of highly differentiated and none the least selective solutions in European countries concerning what will happen in the future with the people who have fled from Ukraine to different European countries. So I'll leave it at that. And
yeah,
that was the introduction.
Thank you. Thank you, Vilde.
Carolina, unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Vilde. Now I will take over with the case of Poland. 1 second. Okay, good. Okay, again, welcome everyone. My name is Karolina Łukasiewicz. I work at the Center of Migration Research in Warsaw, and I will present a case of Poland and our article focusing on selective restrictions and liberalization, unpacking Poland's response to forced migration in the post-2022 context. Okay, and hope that works. Okay, great. Yes, so this paper was co-written by Marta and Andrzej, who I think both are here. Yes, what happened in Poland? So in the first year after full-scale Russian invasion, nearly 1.6 million people were displaced from Ukraine to Poland. At that time, it was the highest number of arrivals. Within months, foreign-born population in Poland nearly doubled. Very quickly, Polish government put in place special legislation allowing full welfare access for temporary protection holders and full access to Polish labor market. But for a very long time, on-the-ground response was mainly shaped by civil society organization, grassroots movement, just ordinary citizens and Ukrainian and Belarusian diaspora living in Poland. And existing studies shows that in general, large migrant arrivals often trigger restrictive short-term policy responses, including limited asylum access and reduced social rights. However, the context of Central Eastern European countries are often overlooked in this analysis, or just portrayed as engaging in so-called race to the restrictive bottom, for example, in asylum policies. So, our research bridges this gap by looking deeper into what happened in Poland. And just like Vilde described earlier, we will use the framework that helps us to look at how different groups of protection seekers in Poland were treated either in a selective or universal way, or the policies, both asylum entry policies and integration policies, were considered either restrictive or liberal. So in our research, we used a combination of analysis of legal documents, statistical, and also qualitative data, including 115 interviews that we conducted with public officials, civil society organization, and other local actors. Overall, we started with analyzing how different group of protection seekers, more specifically asylum seekers, international protection holders, so people who received refugee status in Poland, and temporary protection seekers holders from Ukraine, were treated in Poland in terms of access to different rights and path to citizenship, labor market, welfare access, and public healthcare system access and specific integration assistance. And overall, our analysis reveal selective restrictions and liberalization depending on rights and on groups of protection seekers. So, for example, asylum seekers in Poland have been receiving minimal welfare access, restricted, especially after in the post-2015 context, restrictive asylum entry, and also delayed labor market access and very basic housing rights and very narrow healthcare rights. However, international protection seekers, so people who received a refugee status or subsidiary protection in Poland, receive full welfare access, full labor market access. They are eligible for receiving year-long targeted integration program, and they are on a very clear path to citizenship. And this is different also compared to temporary protection holders, which rights are somewhere in between. In Poland, they did receive immediate labor and welfare access, as well as public with some very minor housing assistance, but they did not receive access to the structured integration programs that are available in Poland to international protection holders, and also their path to citizenship is much more bumpy than the clear and short option for international protection holders. And over the years, as I will in a second show, also their welfare access became increasingly over the years, meaning since 2022, their welfare access has been getting much and much more restrictive. So, so the selectivity of our asylum system in Poland is very well represented when we compare temporary protection holders and their access to temporary protection compared to access to asylum system, for instance. So in this chart, you can see the blue dots indicate people who were allowed in Poland to file for asylum. And historically, these numbers wouldn't go beyond 15,000 people per year. However, the actual number of people granted asylum was much smaller. So these are like the yellow and orange and red bars indicate different forms of international protection in Poland, and those did not exceed 4,000 per year. And suddenly, in this picture, 2022 forced migration from Ukraine started, where the number where Poland would grant at peak even over 1.5 million temporary protection statuses. So obviously there was almost no selectivity in this process as opposed to other groups. And however, this response to Ukrainian temporary protection holders was obviously liberal, but also temporal. So initially, Ukrainian temporary protection holders received immediate labor market access for welfare rights, including healthcare insurance status. They received small housing aid, but over the time, this access to temporary housing was also restricted. They received access to universal child benefit system in Poland, but that also became more restrictive over the time, with linking access to the universal child benefit to the enrollment in the Polish school system, because up until recently in Poland we have only less than half of Ukrainian children in the public school system. It was an outcome of agreement between Polish and Ukrainian government, which allowed Ukrainian children to stay in the Ukrainian education online system only. And also over the years, there are currently in Poland discussed additional restrictions of benefits. However, a new regulations which was related to the EU law included creating somewhat complicated but path to citizenship through permanent residency tied to employment status. On the ground response to the arrival of forced migrants from Ukraine was very much ad hoc, very much privatized, with many service gaps filled by funding from international organization, and other challenges related to accessing mainstream welfare system. So for example, like Vilde mentioned earlier, the initial response was largely decentralized, relying heavily on local authorities, mainly on civil society or organization, and volunteer, also private businesses. It took a very long time to professionalize this aid and centralize more. Initially, Ukrainians often stayed in privatized accommodation. So housing was largely privatized, with refugees staying in volunteer-run centers or private homes of Polish citizens or Ukrainian or Belarusian diaspora. There were many service gaps related to insufficient funding coming from the central government, insufficient legal instructions into how to make the welfare system in Poland accessible to forced migrants from Ukraine, and a lot of service gaps, which then filled up by international organizations who directly connected to civil society organizations in Poland that were then providing a lot of aid. However, this was not sustainable response, and over time a lot of international funding was withdrawn from Poland, and a lot of often needed and critical services disappeared. Overall, large cities in Poland dealt with those challenges better than small cities, because of pre-existing networks of cooperation between local administration, civil society. The Polish response was largely racialized, gendered, and also ethnicized. It was often discussed by local stakeholders that we interviewed, the significant contrast between the response provided to Ukrainian fleeing the war after 2022, and the ongoing and escalating crisis at the Polish-Belarusian border, where protection seekers coming largely from Afghanistan, Central African countries, also Syria, would not be even allowed to file their asylum claim and be pushed back to Belarus, whereas the borders with Ukraine remained widely opened. And so we also observed this selective solidarity, while some organizations present at the civil society organizations and volunteers present at the Polish-Belarusian border would need to hide from authorities with their assistance given to people crossing the border. It was exactly opposite at the Polish-Ukrainian borders. And so, in conclusion, in the Polish case, we can observe selective twofold policy patterns for those protection seekers deemed deserving, such as Ukrainians, and among them overrepresented women and children, and those at the Polish-Belarusian border, often deemed undeserving. We observe privatized and decentralized aid depending on the local context and capacity of local administration and civil society or organization. And also we see perpetuating or exacerbating of long-term trends that we observed earlier in Poland, such as temporarily promoting this temporary solution for protection seekers, which we have seen over the years with Poland, in Poland, with the country being among the top in Europe in terms of temporary migration. And we also see growing mainstreaming opportunities, so opportunities to mainstream public services to the needs of immigrants, which was largely facilitated or happened after 2022. So large Polish cities would often talk about providing multilingual municipal services, but it not necessarily happened, providing information on different city public services or administrative forms in different languages. And this is something that radically shifted after 2022 in Poland, and those initiatives being long discussed but never happened now actually started happening. And again, specifically as for the Ukrainian temporary protection holders, we see the shift from initially open and liberal response to increasingly conditional response. And different factors shaped this response in Poland, increasing already mentioned pre-existing selectivity and temporality in how Polish migration and integration policy are shaped, and also growing privatization, something that meaning that a lot of integration services provided to immigrants in Poland has been offered by private non-profit or for-profit organizations, and this exacerbated after 2022. We see also growing local initiative and growing role of civil society organization. And finally, on a micro level, we see this gender and racialized responses with hierarchies of who is deserving to receive aid in Poland and who is not. And I'm going to finish here and encourage everyone to check our article on selective restrictions and liberalization with more details, and that's available. I already pasted it in the chat window and available online. Thank you very much. Okay. And we can move now to the UK case. So Mette Louisa Berg from University College London will present the UK response. Just checking. Oh,
great. Thank you so much, Carolina, and thank you, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Can everyone see this?
Yes, yes,
Great.
I can.
Okay, all right. So I'm presenting on behalf of the three co-authors, Laura Cassu, myself, and Silke Schomler. And our article is called Privatized Asylum, the UK's response to protection seekers fleeing Ukraine. And you'll see there are lots of resonances with the Polish case that we've just been hearing about. So as probably everyone in this room know, European government responses to Ukrainians fleeing their country in the wake of the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022 set a really different tone from the increasing hostility against people seeking sanctuary that has characterized political discourse across Europe in the past decade. And the UK response largely followed this pattern. So in contrast to prevailing anti-refugee rhetoric, the government declared Ukrainians welcome and set up 3 visa-based schemes to facilitate their entry. The schemes were built around hosting in private homes, hence the privatizing in the title, and led to an unprecedented and hospitable response from the general public. So more than 200,000 Ukrainians arrived under the schemes. And in the article, we go into quite some detail around the differences between the schemes, who they were for, what support and entitlements existed between the scheme, and there was a lot of differentiation, but I don't have time to go into that in the presentation today. So in our contribution, we ask if the Ukraine schemes are the sign of a new direction in asylum policy, or is it rather an exceptional case? And we situate the Ukraine response in the context of the UK's liberal welfare state model and austerity policies, and within an overall fragmented asylum and immigration policy, making that really doesn't have a strategic focus on integration. UK immigration policy is deeply racialized and intimately linked to the country's history of empire and colonialism. And in recent years, we've seen restrictions on the right to asylum and a criminalization of so-called illegal entry. And so in this context, the welcoming response to Ukrainian protection seekers seemed to break the mold. But we argue that it is actually rather consistent with what Tomlinson has called the new bespokeism, and that it relies on racialized and gendered tropes that configure Ukrainians as uniquely deserving over and above other groups, and so thereby fractioning the refugee label. This trend is consistent with the Europe-wide trend towards increasing use of temporary permits, and it also resonates with wider privatization policies. So the article draws on an in-depth review of asylum policies from 2015 to 2025, and also original qualitative research with Ukrainian visa holders, UK hosts, experts in the field, and frontline and support workers. And so our article offers insights into the UK's changing post-Brexit migration regime and its fragmented and complex policy landscape vis-à-vis forced migrants and protection seekers. It also adds further nuance to the discussion of a unified European approach towards people fleeing the war in Ukraine. So we contextualize and compare the UK approach. We compare it with other UK bespoke schemes for particular groups, and there has been a real proliferation of these schemes in recent years. Yeah, so there's some detail on that, and also on the real complexity that this proliferation of schemes entails. We then compare it with the UK asylum system, which is also privatized, but in a different way, in that large for-profit companies have contracts to provide services, including dispersal accommodation, which is offered on a no-choice basis. So there's two different forms of privatization we can see, and that has led to very vastly different experiences, but also vastly different geographies. So we see Ukrainians having been hosted in different parts of the UK from where people in the asylum system are dispersed to. There are also differences around access to the labor market and to the welfare system. So the Ukraine schemes gave Ukrainian protection seekers immediate access to the labor market and also to the welfare system, whereas the asylum system is much more restrictive in that sense, in that people in the asylum system, as a rule, generally are not allowed to work, and also don't have access to the welfare system, but are placed in a kind of a separate stream of lower tariff asylum support. And we also saw real differences, very similar perhaps to the Polish case, of differences in availability of support on the ground. So local authorities have largely been sidelined in the asylum system, whereas they were drawn in and were supported financially to welcome Ukrainians. And so that also created different opportunities locally for local authorities and other groups. A very fundamental difference as well in comparing to other European countries is that the UK had a visa requirement, which is very different from the temporary protection directive, but we did see a similarity with other European countries in the trend towards selectivity and temporariness. It was just implemented in a different way. What then struck us was that perhaps we can talk about an Anglo-Saxon approach in that it seemed that both Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US all had visa requirements as well, very similar to the UK case, although there were different levels of selectivity and universality in each of those countries as well. So to conclude, we examined the UK's approach towards protection seekers from Ukraine in comparison with the country's asylum system and other refugee resettlement schemes, and also in the context of the EU's Temporary Protection Directive, as well as the visa-based approaches adopted by other Anglo-Saxon countries. And we ask if the UK's visa-based Ukraine schemes are a sign of a new policy direction for the country, and then show that the political and the policy preference for limited, ad hoc, and bespoke schemes and legislation contributes to a fracturing of the refugee label by entrenching fragile and time-limited forms of protection that prioritizes wider geopolitical interests and military priorities over human rights. Crucially, the policy privatizes the responsibility for asylum onto private citizens. And this new bespokeism of proliferating ad hoc schemes creates a complex system of legally enforced unequal treatment of people seeking protection. Protection seekers are grouped differently through policy abstraction and procedural implementation based on scheme eligibility, rather than a needs assessment or a rights-based approach, as you might see if you had implemented it, used or drawn on international refugee frameworks. So the UK case highlights a diversion with the wider European approach in its adoption of a visa-based strategy, albeit with some commonalities with EU members, specifically with regards to selectivity and temporariness. And it highlights a convergence with the visa-based policy strategies adopted by Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, so suggesting that we could speak of an Anglo-Saxon approach. It introduces multiple layers of complexity, and so the UK case study adds further nuance to discussions of a unified European approach towards Ukrainians fleeing the war, and adds to our understanding of the ongoing crisis of international protection. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. That was great. Okay, it works. Great. So now we will move to the next case. We're going back to the European Union, and Nora Ratzman from the team in Berlin will discuss Germany's response to forced migration from Ukraine. Okay, there you go.
Works now, right? It's full screen.
Yes, we see you. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for coming and for giving the opportunity to present the German case. I'm speaking on behalf of my two co-authors as well, Magdalena Nowicka and Markus Engle, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And what you will hear will closely resonate as well with the two case studies we already heard, maybe with some slight differences. So we got into this research similar to other projects in 2022, where we started working with Ukrainian families in a longitudinal qualitative approach and talked to them on their experiences of arriving in Berlin and Munich. This project had two spin-offs. One was this mapping exercise, which was already mentioned for the other countries, where since 2015 we've been mapping what's been happening in the field of migration and asylum in terms of policy responses, and this has been one of the data sources for this paper. And the other one is that we started working with municipalities in Germany, asking how their experience is of implementing the TPD, but also in general integration policy in the current climate. And we've been using 15 expert interviews with different representatives from civil society, MSOs, welfare organizations, and some local government experts. And our aim was to unpack, in line with the general framework, if the TPD in Germany and its implementation is as liberal as often advanced in German and political discourse. And we do so by contrasting sort of the legal regulations, so what's written on paper with the lived experience of de facto access. And as this whole special issue, we want to contribute to the debate on generosity or selectivity of welfare policies for non-citizens. Similar to what's been also said on the Polish and UK case, it's been a tradition as well in Germany that we've seen a lot more long-term towards selectivity in terms of rights to protection, but also the socioeconomic rights of those seeking protection or already having protection in Germany. And if you map it on a time continuum, you can see each time a large number has been arriving, the policy response has been restrictions. The TPD can be seen in line with this selectivity trend because, as we all know, it's limited to one group, mostly Ukrainian who have a Ukrainian passport arriving in Germany seeking refuge, and some exceptions. But what we've been interested in this article is to say, well, this group has had a quite specific demographic profile, meaning that it's been mostly women with often minor children arriving in Germany and having these care responsibilities. So we tried to examine how those liberal entitlements under TPD play out in practice through a gender-sensitive lens, asking for whom it is de facto liberal or selective. And we found that there is a de facto selectivity among the group of Ukrainian protection holders regarding gender, as we see more barriers for those with care responsibilities when they try to translate legal rights into de facto access. Why is that? So if we look at the example of employment and welfare rights, Germany is based on the conservative welfare state model, as some of you know, which means it was traditionally the male breadwinner model, meaning that if you're in full-time regular employment, you get full social rights. So employment becomes the key access point to any access to social benefits and entitlements. And we also know from previous studies that childcare is sort of the bottleneck and the key barrier to female employment in Germany. What we then see see currently under TPD is, on the one hand, there are on paper liberal rights for the selective group of protection holders. There is preferential treatment because they have immediate right to employment compared to other refugee groups in Germany seeking asylum. They can get a labor market, they can get support for labor market integration through local job centers. They have higher social benefits than asylum seekers up to date. There is currently happening a legislative change. I don't know if you've been following the news, if it's also mentioned abroad, but right now the new government is pushing through that Ukrainian protection holders should be moved to the benefit level of other asylum seekers, but up to date they had the same as other as anyone who was getting basic social benefits. Also, they have immediate access to language and integration courses. But if we look at the numbers from other statistics and studies for the period of 22 to 24, only 70% of TPD protection holders have participated in such courses, so 30% have not. And if we look at employment rates, we are at about 29% in 24 for female protection holders, and only at 14% for single mothers having children under the year of 6, compared to 35% for male protection holders. And part of what we try to do in this paper using our qualitative interviews. So what came really through the expert interviews who've been working with protection holders, helping them to secure their rights, is that a huge barrier to participating in integration on language courses, which in the German system tends to be the first step to labor market integration, are childcare responsibilities. I've put one quote by one of our experts who said that almost all his female clients who want to attend an integration course can't do it because they don't have the time and the capacity with children. And in general, there is a shortage in affordable childcare in the German system. So that's one problem why there's a lower attendance rate. But there's also this rule that you don't have to participate in integration measures proposed by the job center as long as your child is younger than 3 years. So what we see in numbers is that about 76% of Ukrainian children between 3 and 6 attend daycare compared to 91% of the general population, which is quite a substantial difference. And then another reason comes into play, apart from securing a place in state service, is also organizing oneself, because they're like bureaucratic barriers. It's not a very transparent system how to secure a place. And if you arrive in a situation of flight, there's the role of trauma, but also the mental and emotional burden of suddenly facing de facto single parenthood. As we know, for quite a long time, there had been a ban for male Ukrainians to leave the country. So women were forced to come here on their own with their children. And that substantially impacted their future planning and also their sort of ideas about staying or leaving and going the next steps in the integration pathway of learning the language, putting their kids into daycare, schools, etc. What we see right now in first studies which have been conducted, and some of the numbers I presented earlier, is an delayed integration of this group, even though they're highly skilled and language would be key in securing also highly skilled employment in Germany. And another factor adding on to it is that a lot of these women tend to be in areas which require an official recognition of qualifications, because they work in regulated sectors such as education, medicine, formal care, and that's another barrier to go into employment. So what we see in general is, first of all, there are tensions with like personal future planning regarding return and unstable situation, but also ideas about entering the labor market immediately versus the learning the language first, which tends to be the way opted for by job centers. We can also see that gender neutral policies, which are on paper selective but liberal for this group, tend to become de facto more selective due to this double burden of care and missing capacity in state services regarding childcare. And what's also been mentioning, especially by Caroline, is that this insecurity of TPD status is another problem in the longer term, because right now there's no direct legal pathway in Germany. Once this TPD expires, the only like secure way to stay is to use the employment route, which again then poses problem for women with care responsibility who might not be fully or not available to the labor market, creating heightened vulnerability and precarity through care responsibilities, and poses questions on their long-term integration and also perspectives for citizenship. Thanks. I will leave it here, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to go about it in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions to the speakers, please feel free to type them in the chat window. Now we will move to the case of Finland and Sweden, presented by Sarah Koikalainen. Okay, and I'm giving the floor to Sarah.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello. Are you seeing my screen okay?
Yes, we see your screen. Okay,
great. Yes, so my name is Sarah Koikalainen. I'm from the University of Eastern Finland, and I'm presenting our article that we wrote jointly with co-authors Oksana, Yoni, Asmiri, and Svitlana, unpacking the temporary protection of displaced people from Ukraine within the tightening migration governance in Sweden and Finland. And the context of our article is, as in other presentations already, the race to the bottom in the European migration governance. We know that migration has been a controversial topic in the political debates since the so-called European refugee crisis. And what we're currently witnessing is not only a death of asylum, but also a gradual death of permanency in the migration governance regimes, as status precarity is on the rise. And already in many European countries, there is a complex hierarchy of civic stratification, with migrants in different categories enjoying different rights. And in this context, we examine the restrictive tendencies in Swedish and Finnish asylum and refugee policies, and consider the national implementation of the Temporary Protection Directive against the backdrop of these changes. So our cases are these two Nordic welfare states that have many similarities in the society, but they also have different histories of migration. Sweden has been a net receiver of immigrants since the 1950s. It has had exceptionally open humanitarian migration policies, whereas Finland became a net receiver only in the 1980s and 90s, has had a much more cautious policies, and has received significantly lower number of arrivals. In both countries, the Temporary Protection Directive introduced a new protection category that operates alongside the established immigration system, increasing its complexity. And we look at temporality and power in migration governance in more detail in the article. And we also use the Relisio framework and argue that time and temporality are important dimensions in this analysis of how restrictive, liberal, selective, or universal migration policies are, as well as the kinds of rights that different categories of protection seekers are entitled to. And we ultimately argue that for the Ukrainians, the supposedly generous protection status turned out to be a temporary and limited welcome, providing them with no certainty for the future. As has already been said, there's no kind of clear path forward of what will happen once the war ultimately ends and remigration to Ukraine becomes possible. And we also note that the Temporary Protection Directive, as the EU's response to those fleeing Russia's attack, is not merely an act of generosity, but is indicative of an increasing trend toward more flexible and transitional solutions for all types of international protection. And our two interlinked research questions and data are: how have Sweden and Finland's asylum and refugee policies developed since the European refugee crisis? We examined the Aliens Acts of the two countries. They are the two key laws defining immigration policy and practice. And since then, quite indicative of this policy changes is that since 2015, in the past 10 years, the laws have been amended 51 and 61 times respectively. And since our article was submitted in Finland, there have been more amendments because the government is still implementing new changes to the law that are making the thing more restrictive again. The second question is then related to the topic of the special issue. How do the social rights conveyed by the directive differ from rights granted to other protection seekers? So we're not comparing the situation of those who have protection or to Finnish citizens or Swedish citizens, but those who have temporary protection status and those who are in the asylum process still. So the Protection Directive and the relevant national regulations, government acts, guidelines, and statistics were our data in this case. And in both countries, the directive was incorporated in national legislation in early 2000s, as in other EU countries as well. But the method of how it was implemented was based on ad hoc decisions starting from March 22. So there was kind of no ready-made solution of what to do once the directive is implemented. And I'm not going to go into detail because of time, so that we have discussion time left. But these are the kinds of things we looked at in the migration governance system. These are examples of the legal changes that have been made in Swedish Aliens Act and how it has gradually restricted the rights of the protection seekers and immigrants in Sweden. And here is a similar graph from Finland. This you can find in the article itself and have a closer look. And on the second question, social rights of temporary protection holders versus other protection seekers. So both Finland and Sweden had Ukrainian migrants before 2022. The relative share of them was higher in Finland, and mainly, or partially at least due to this, Finland adopted a very open interpretation of the directive itself. So the temporary protection was available for also those Ukrainians who already resided in Finland during when the war broke out. So you didn't have to be in Ukraine and flee from there to be granted temporary protection in Finland. So in 22 to 24, Finland granted temporary protection to around 79,000 Ukrainians and Sweden to 68,000 Ukrainians. And Finland has received more protection seekers from Ukraine, but also retained more of them. In September 25, the Eurostat figure shows that in Finland there are 76,000 and in Sweden 47,000 people under temporary protection at the moment. And the comparison of these temporary protection holder rights versus other protection seekers reveals that those under temporary protection are not plainly in a privileged position, and access to rights depend on the time of the stay in the country. In some respects, they are more privileged. For example, they have immediate access to the labor market, but in other respects, it is not so clear-cut. And in both countries, the temporary protection seekers were first accommodated in the same system as asylum seekers. In Sweden, they were given similar provisions as asylum seekers: housing, schooling for children, emergency medical care, and it's good to note only emergency medical care, right to work, and limited financial support. They have the same social rights as asylum seekers until temporary protection ends. So this was the Swedish solution, that the Ukrainians will stay in the asylum system until they can return. But as the war dragged on, in 23 additional rights were introduced to the Ukrainians, like access to language courses, residence rights, for example, inclusion in the Swedish population register. First, you would have had to stay in Sweden for 2 years, and later it was changed to 1 year. So kind of after 1 year, you would be included in the population that's resident in Sweden and not in this limbo waiting for something. In Finland, also similar services, reception services were given as to asylum seekers, including housing, healthcare, a reception allowance, and necessary social services via a reception center. And the Ukrainians were granted a temporary 1-year resident permit, which means that they're in the country temporarily, but due to the Finnish Act on Municipal Residence, after 1 year in the country, they were allowed to apply for municipal residency, and the level of financial support and access to services changes significantly after that. This rule is not based on the Ukrainian situation or the temporary protection per se, but the residence permit that they were granted was similar to a student or a work permit that's first temporary, and then after a year, the state considers that your stay is so permanent that you're kind of included in the population resident in Finland. So after 1 year, the situation of the Ukrainians improved considerably. And this is again an example of what kind of comparisons we make in the actual article. We look at the situation in regards to housing, healthcare, path to permanent residency, for example, in Sweden and in Finland, and the two cases where the differences between those who have temporary protection and those who are seeking asylum are visible. And to conclude, so both countries' policies have clearly turned from liberal and universal towards more selective and restrictive ones during the analysis period. And it's obvious that national security considerations have been stressed over the rights of the protection seekers. And many of these policy changes aim to minimize the time that unwanted foreigners spent in the country, including speeding up the application process, rejecting as many claims as possible, making humanitarian protection statuses temporary, and enforcing strict deportation policies, for example. And despite a larger number of arrivals from Ukraine, Finland stands out as more welcoming than Sweden, contrary to how these countries have treated humanitarian migrants before 2015, for example. In Sweden, the kind of ethos was more that they were seen as one more case of a mass arrival of humanitarian migrants, and in the Swedish discussion, this signified something unwanted in a way. Whereas in Finland, the Ukrainians were seen as a special case that is worth exemplary treatment, and they were welcomed as guests from a country that also shares a long border with Russia. And the main concern with the Ukrainians at the moment is that, as has been noted in other presentations, time spent under temporary protection does not qualify for anything permanent. It's not accounted towards residence periods that are required for permanent residency, for example. It extends both temporality and uncertainty of life to the years ahead. And we conclude also that the logic of the directive as a temporary solution resonates with the restrictive and selective turn in Nordic and European asylum policies. And we fear that it may serve as a case study for how future crises are handled so that granting international protection does not lead to a right to stay. But this would be kind of the dismantling of the refugee status as a way into the citizenship and inclusion in the country as an equal resident. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. We learn again about the comparative perspective, and now we can move to the next presentation, which will be again Vilde Hernes from Oslo Met, this time discussing a comparative case of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Yes, I'm leaving the floor to Vilde. Go ahead.
Yes, okay. You hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so now I have the pleasure of presenting the Scandinavian comparative article, which is co-written with my colleague Åsne Danielsen, titled Turning Scandinavian Integration and Settlement Policies Upside Down. So a common scale that is also included in the Relisio framework is to classify countries on a restrictive or liberal scale. Traditionally, the Scandinavian countries have been very interesting to use as a case study or comparative case study, because despite being relatively similar social democratic welfare states, they have traditionally had very different immigration and integration policies. So Denmark has often been classified as having some of the most restrictive policies in Europe. Sweden has been classified as a liberal haven, while Norway has been somewhere in the middle between its more two extreme neighbors. However, after 2022, something has happened. So for Ukrainian refugees, the restrictive Denmark liberalized some of its policies. And Norway first also liberalized many policies for Ukrainian refugees. But after the fall of 2023, when Norway received relatively larger share of Ukrainian refugees compared to its neighbors, they introduced several restrictions to become a less attractive destination country. And lastly, Sweden, which has been one of the most liberal countries in Europe, was deemed to have some of the most restrictive policies in the EU for Ukrainian refugees. So our less academic puzzle or research question is, what the hell happened here? The more academic formulation of these research questions in this article, using the two dimensions in the Relisio framework, is what has been the policy development for Ukrainian refugees in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And then we use these two dimensions. Has it been more liberal or restrictive policies? And do we see selective policies, particularly for Ukrainian refugees, or are they included more generally into the policies for those who are granted protection? And then also we ask, why have we seen this very different development and policies for this group? And in this article, we focus on 4 areas. So we focus on protection permits, reception and settlement, integration measures, and the financial assistance that these groups are entitled to. So let's jump into the analysis. So let's first look at the restrictive Denmark. So if you first look at how the policies were before 2022. So in Denmark, they normally have a publicly steered settlement model with central allocation of individuals to different municipalities. And after 2016, they have what is called the 1-year self-sufficiency and repatriation program, which is a type of introduction program, where they focus on rapid employment in any kind of job. And they also get mean tested social benefits to all immigrants, minimum the first 9 years, which is at lower levels than other Danish citizens. So the Danish response to the arrival of Ukrainian refugees included some more liberal policies for housing and self-settlement compared to other refugees and asylum seekers. But otherwise, Denmark included Ukrainian refugees to have the same rights and obligations as other refugees to participate in the introduction program and the financial assistance. And otherwise, there has been very little debate or major or policy changes the first 3 years after the full-scale invasion in Denmark. So jumping to Norway. Norway generally has a publicly steered settlement model with central local agreements, and it has an introduction program which varies from 6 months to 4 years, focusing on formal qualification and long-term stable labor market attachment. And they also have specialized introduction benefits for those who participate in the introduction program. So what happened after 2022 then? So in the beginning, Norway introduced more liberal housing and settlement practices for Ukrainian refugees than for other protection seekers or beneficiaries. Otherwise, Norway also, like Denmark, provided this group with mainly the similar rights for integration measures, but it was more, instead of long-term focus, it was a focus on short-term and intense rapid employment. And initially, they also actually increased the financial support for all asylum seekers when there was media coverage of how low and terrible condition it was for asylum seekers in general. However, after the fall of 2023, Norway received a relatively higher share of arrivals compared to other Nordic countries. And the Norwegian government introduced then a series of restrictions to become, quote, a less attractive destination country for Ukrainian refugees. So they removed several of the temporary exceptions for allowing pets or liberal settlement. They reduced the financial benefits. And Norway became the first European country to ban temporary visits to Ukraine. So if they visit Ukraine and this is still valid, they lose their protection permit. And from October 2024, Norway also became the first and then only European country that has deemed parts of Ukraine as safe, implying that persons from these regions, those western and central regions, will not get collective temporary protection in Norway. So let's turn to Sweden. The general policies in Sweden has been a very liberal self-settlement model, and they had a 2-year introduction program called Etableringsprogrammet and a special introduction benefit for participants in the introduction program. But what has then given Sweden the reputation of being the worst country for Ukrainian refugees? So most importantly in Sweden, Ukrainian refugees continued on asylum seeker rights even after they were granted protection for the first 3 years. So that means they are not registered in the National Population Register, and the implication was that they had were not entitled to any integration measures or language training. They continued on asylum seeker financial benefits, which is at much lower benefits than for others who are granted protection. They had limited healthcare rights, only entitled to emergency healthcare. So generally, they had fewer rights than other groups who were granted protection than in Sweden. Recently, however, after the initial policies, there have been some changes for this group. So from July 2023, they did get the right for Swedish language training. The new legislation from November 2024, which Sara mentioned shortly, is that you transition to get more normal rights after 1 year instead of 3 years. However, at the same time, they also introduced new restrictions, particularly targeting Ukrainian refugees for certain financial benefits. So even though we see a little step towards a liberal direction, they also included more restrictive and selective rights for this group. So to summarize, what has been the main differences and main drivers in the Scandinavian countries? And I'm not going to get into this detailed table now, so this is just a little tease, but in the article we have this table summarizing all the different topics we study, classify them, whether they was introduced with more liberal or restrictive, selective or universal policies, and how it developed over time. So that's something you can look into for the details. But generally in Denmark, we see more liberal settlement rights, but otherwise it was business as usual. And we explain this because after what has been called a paradigm shift in Danish integration policies after the 2015 influx, actually, Denmark has already had a short-term and temporary perspective for all refugees. Thus, the temporary perspective for Ukrainian refugees fitted rather nicely also for this group, not necessitating major changes. And in Norway, however, we see U-turn from a liberal and very kind of selective approach towards more restrictive policies for Ukrainian refugees, more in line with policies for other refugees as well. And we also see now a very change in the political discourse. So although solidarity with Ukraine and the war is still preached, there is a clear turn highlighting that Norway cannot have better policies than other countries, and a new debate about who are the real deserving Ukrainians in the shadow of more men arriving, and the question whether persons from the western and eastern central part of Ukraine needs protection. And lastly, Sweden had a clearly restrictive and selective turn, particularly for Ukrainian refugees. So they have recently taken some steps towards more liberalization, but it's still very selective. And in our studies, it shows that there has been surprisingly little debate about Ukrainians. So the debate in Sweden is still about immigrants in general. But there has been in Sweden this focus on the paradigm shift after 2015, and they have introduced very restrictive immigration and integration policies more generally. And this is, so we see that Ukrainians are more of a casual collateral damage than being particularly highlighted in the political discourse. So just to conclude, as we write in the paper, the Scandinavian countries are prime examples of how the European unified response to the influx of displaced persons from Ukraine is a very fragile construct when we investigate this group's rights beyond this collective temporary protection permit. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was great. So now we can start
Q&A.
Q&A. Yes, Marta,
Okay.
I will
So
give you
should
a
I take
call.
over, or you want
Yes,
to take?
please. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay. So as we said during the opening of our today's seminar, after all these significant contributions, but creating one big, great special issue, we have time for your comments and questions. There are still almost 40 colleagues with us online, so we are very happy. So please, could you just maybe raise your hand to make our discussion more dynamic and refer to specific papers, to general topic of the special issue, share your perspective, ask questions. That's time for you. And in the meantime, in the chat, as you can see, Karolina was also another colleagues providing you with the links to specific papers so you can look at them. I see that our audience is very shy, or everything is so clear that there is no need for follow-ups.
We have one question to Vilde and also to other authors.
Yes, please.
How do you see the future of forced migrant protection in Europe? What has the temporary protection done to the international protection in your view? So that's a specific question to Vilde, but also to other authors. How do they see it from their country perspective?
Yeah, that's a huge question, but I think it's this project started as somebody mentioned here with a comparative project we did called Govrain, where we also compared the development since 2015. So in this special issue, we focus a little bit more on the period after 2022. And as most of you know, this temporality and the temporary perspective is not new for Ukrainians. So this is a trend that has been ongoing for many permits, that you have shorter permits, more temporary permits, higher requirements for getting permanent residency or citizenship. So we see this more as a continuation of an ongoing trend with the temporary permits. And I don't think there's anything that sees that this will turn in any way. But the only thing that could be is that we are, of course, as many are, very curious about how many will actually return. Because I know at least in the Norwegian public debate, we also try to discuss, if they are actually here to stay, the majority, it's better to invest in qualification, getting their qualifications recognized, investing in the Norwegian language, for example, to ensure long-term integration. So if the outfall is that the majority of Ukrainians stay in the European host countries, then perhaps there will be a debate about that this temporary perspective for so many years was damaging for the integration part of it. But maybe that's wishful thinking on my behalf. But I know that that is a dilemma that comes across many countries as well. Should we invest and try to focus on the integration and if the majority actually stays, was it not that good to have this temporary perspective? Because we do know from many studies the damages of having this insecure status as well. So I don't have the answer for it, but I'm not very optimistic, but hope that maybe we could have a discussion about the downsides of the insecure status as well. Yeah.
Any other comments maybe from the authors of other papers to this issue? If not, I have some follow-up questions. So we know well that the temporary protection, as the name indicates, is rather a kind of, at least for me as a forced migration researcher, reception kind tool. So it's not in fact a typical full protection status as the ones we know from EU asylum framework, and also the asylum statuses incorporated to the EU member states. So do you think that it's correct? This is, and to what extent it's justified to use the expression or consider temporary protection in terms of integration, because it's not so obvious. There are different approaches, as we can see, for example, in practice of our non-governmental organizations, also in different approaches applied by researchers. So, for example, for me, this is rather reception stage compared to the asylum proceedings, when we have applicants for international protection for a refugee status, while some colleagues say it's rather integration, obviously not the one legally defined, but rather this in practice. So what are your stance on it? I mean, Vilde, but also colleagues, contributors to the special issue from other countries, how it looks from your perspective, maybe national one, what are the lessons learned? So who would like to address this? A pretty detailed question with no obvious answer. We can start with Vilde, obviously, to encourage colleagues that are still with us, but then I would be really happy to have feedback and voices from other co-authors.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. I think this is something we debated during all of these comparative analysis as well. I mentioned it a little bit in the presentation, that who are we comparing the rights to? Is it asylum or protection seekers, or is it those who are granted protection? And it's very different in the different countries. And it is no easy answer to say what it is. I think the temporary collective temporary protection, as you say, is definitely, it's just a crisis response, because European countries could not take so many people and do individual asylum assessments for everybody at once. So it's a short-term temporary crisis response and reception solution. The challenge is with the protracted war. Then it isn't just, because if it ended after 2 months and everybody could go home, that would be a very easy solution. That is something it's just a crisis response and a reception crisis. But when the wars protract, and normally they do, I mean, there's very few examples of very short wars where you had the temporary protection during the Bosnian War, etc. as well. So I think this. I have one experience where we presented the Ukrainian case in another academic article, and the reviewer said, but it's not interesting at all to look at this, because the Ukrainian refugees are it's such a forced migrants from Ukraine are such a special case. But I think it's important that we stop treating them as a very special case, and discussing how this that they are specific case, but it's not that different. I think the special issue also highlights some of that it's not that different from the general debates of, long-term, short-term perspective, temporary versus permanent. So it is within the overall general debate. In the first few months, it was very particular. I don't think it is anymore, at least not from more the Nordic perspective, and also reading the other articles as I edited it. But it's very different in different countries, how this is debated and perceived. So other researchers may have very different perspectives depending on which country they come from. And I think that is the interesting with this special issue, because it sees the divergence in the responses in European countries.
Sarah wants to.
Yes, please contribute. Just jump in.
Yes, I think in terms of what this all means to European protection politics and asylum processes and all this, what kind of impact this will have, I think we have to wait until there's some sort of repatriation going on, so that we know actually, as Ville said, how many go back. And also once we know more about, because like one of the best qualities or the privileges that they had was that they could access the labor market immediately, whereas asylum seekers usually have to wait 3 to 6 months, for example, in Finland. So how many actually found work? Because maybe there was an idea that because they come from within Europe and they have more skills maybe than somebody arriving from a refugee camp outside the EU, that maybe they would be easier access to the labor market. So once we know more about that, and maybe Vilde could say like 2 words about the Nordic project that we have ongoing, where we are looking at register data on this to see exactly how many, for example, in the Nordic countries have been working, so that maybe we know more about this, how integrated they have been in the labor markets of the countries, because that plays a role also in who returns and who stays.
Thank you, Sarah. Do you have any other comments from our contributors and co-authors? If not, I don't see any hands raised. We have the question from Eva Cichocka from CMR. Thank you for organizing this interesting seminar. I have a quite broad question about the Swedish case. I wonder why did Swedish approach differed so much from the rest of Scandinavian countries, considering the fact that we know Sweden for its liberal policies and broad welfare policies. Is the political debate that different than in the other countries, or something else happened there? So I would ask our co-authors specializing in Sweden to address this question now. Who would like to do this?
Both and Sarah.
Who would like to start?
Well, maybe Oksana could, from our article call, say, because she's based in Gothenburg.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm a bit sick, so my voice is not really holding well. But thank you for this question. It has been a puzzle, and it's still very much debated to why Sweden differs so much. And I think that the internal discussions and analysis on the Swedish case are now turning to linking the political development in Sweden at the time of arrival of Ukrainians, meaning that Sweden got a quite far-right government quite at the time of the starting of the full-scale invasion. And in a sense, the whole system has been changing so drastically that I would say that the government and society decided to treat Ukrainian cases, in many cases we've heard here, as something exceptional, maybe short-lived. And Sweden actually put more effort on helping Ukraine when it comes to weapons and money and etc. than to helping Ukrainians inside of the country. And one of the comments during the presentation was about the fact that there is not so much public debate. The thing is that in Sweden, you will see the voices raised for the rights of Ukrainians would be from the civil society, from Ukrainians themselves, from diaspora, from interest organizations of different kinds. But all political parties agree that we have to keep the situation as it is. We liberalize some rules, but we do not discuss. All politicians agree on this, and maybe this presents some kind of a wall. There is no questioning, there are no limitations ongoing, and etc. But the situation is really tough. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Do we have other comments on it, Vilde?
I can just add to the question also say, that Sweden has generally had liberal policy. So I think we conclude in our article that the Swedish liberal exception is dead. It's over. But that is not only now after 2022. So I think that 2015 was the immense shock for Sweden, where they got 8 times more than the EU average of asylum seekers. And after that, it has gone from being this liberal political debate to after a couple of years, very restrictive turn, and they are very explicit in their policies now. And it's a more radical right government, but it's also the whole political spectrum has shifted more or less like European countries had done 20 years. Most other European countries had done 20 years ago. But now it's more of a, you can say, and it's happening very fast in Sweden. But it's been very interesting when me, students and others try to study the Swedish case, and we have to look so hard to find any political processes. And it's just a couple of questions, and then we have to ask the bureaucracy, is this all that it is? Is there something we're missing? And they say, no, there's no debate. It is, as you said, from the NGOs, etc. But from the politician side, there's almost no debate at all. And it seems like they just don't want to talk about it. And let's not make a fuss about it, and let's try to silence it, is the impression, at least, also being in Sweden in several conferences as well.
Thank you. So now we have one more question in our chat by a colleague from Abo Academy University, Finland, Liselott Sundbäck. Let me read for those that do not follow chat. This might be a bit out of the scope, but while it seems as we see similar patterns of precarities in this group in comparison to other groups in need of international protection, I wonder if any of you noted tensions in how ordinary asylum seekers not protected by the EU TPD perceived Ukrainians arriving to the countries you research. Was this an issue among professionals? I understand this was not the main aim of your research, but perhaps an interesting question. So who would like to address? Maybe we can start with colleagues not only from Scandinavia, maybe Mette and Nora would like. Mette, I think, has left earlier, but maybe Nora, you would like to add something from your research perspective, from the German case.
Yeah, just give me a second.
So this is, I would say, about the attitudes and also reactions of other protection statuses, let's say this typical and regular protection statuses. Do we see anything like this in intergroup relations?
Actually, we did some interviews with, on the one hand, service providers and representatives of local government, and they constantly pointed to this tension of not being allowed to open certain services to other than Ukrainian protection holders because of the funding nature. For instance, that in following 2022 invasion, specific funds were made available to create support services for TPD holders. For instance, specific language courses, or that material was translated in certain languages such as Ukrainian or Russian. And then they were like telling us that they encountered a lot of grievances from other asylum seeking groups who have been waiting for such a place for a very long time, or that they were trying to be creative themselves. If some of the funds were like, they had leftovers, they would say we translate into English, so it's more widely accessible also for other groups who may have the same questions. But in general, they didn't see how they could resolve this tension, but felt that it really entrenched unequal treatment and created huge grievances. at the local level and tensions. Also examples such as Ukrainians in the beginning were allowed to travel for free, for instance, on trains, and why not other groups who also had were seeking refuge. Yeah, these are just some examples, but it was darkly visible in the data.
Thank you, Nora, for this German perspective. Karolina, you would like to add something from Poland?
Yeah, exactly. Just very briefly that we observed similar patterns in Poland where there was this huge temporary international funding flowing to Polish civil society organizations for specific services, specifically for Ukrainians, and a lot of organizations who were in general providing aid for different groups of immigrants struggled with that, for example, they were not able to offer this or enroll, I don't know, Syrian refugees for these programs, but they could only enroll Ukrainians and not any other groups. So there were this type of tensions regarding special treatments granted to Ukrainians, only both at the level of forced migrants themselves as well as service providers.
Thank you, Karolina, for the Polish perspective. And as we have still around 10 minutes, we have another question just to diversify the topics we cover. So Małgorzata Ruszkowska, a newcomer, I understand, to our CMR Labs series, asks, have there been any educational and support programs implemented nice to see you, for Ukrainian refugees and the officials representatives of the welcoming country managing their assimilation? My small correction, I think it's about rather integration, because we know well that it's not like assimilation typically understood, for example, by Barry. So who would like to address this question from our colleagues?
I mean, I can briefly start with the Polish case. So yeah, we had a lot of specific targeted programs across Polish schools, but these were usually not centralized initiatives. So like usually either UNICEF or sometimes UNHCR would fund programs, for example, to hire cultural assistants. So either to hire Ukrainian teachers or people of Ukrainian origin or members of Ukrainian diaspora at schools to facilitate the participation of Ukrainian children in the Polish education system. The most successful solutions were, I would say, those which engaged local administration so far. So Lublin, for example, the city of Lublin in Poland, nearby Ukrainian border, kind of pioneered in hiring or streamlining the process of hiring Ukrainian teachers in Polish schools so that they could support multilingual education of Ukrainian children. And we had like a hugely discussed national level program, which would finally make this effort, this very, very fragmented effort, sustainable long term, with hiring the so-called cultural assistants on a regular government payroll in Polish schools. So that's something that has been very contested and debated at the national level in Poland.
As far as I understand, also your question, Małgorzata, is not so much only about, for example, the type of support in education, primary, secondary schools, like intercultural assistants. It's about if there were or are any designed, narrowed and specialized, let's say, orientation programs, integration programs. I would say that we don't, for example, in Poland, we don't have something of this highly structured. Obviously, some bigger municipalities, they provide a kind of training for their staff, just to increase, for example, their cross-cultural management competencies, to increase their language capacity. So this has happened, and this is on the rise, but mostly in big cities. But we are just in the phase of developing at the national level in Poland the very first integration policy for 2025-2023. by the Department of Social Integration. So this is just now drafted with different also now specific tools that are dedicated to the receiving society, including the competencies of the officials. So we will see if the program will be approved, because it would systematize everything that we have in our hands, also from the perspective of the fact to be prepared, in fact, to work with different foreign populations. It's not only about Ukrainians. So, it's always highly politically conditioned. So there is a good intention by one of the ministries, Ministry of Social Policy and Labor Market. But if it will happen around early April, we don't know, but we support this. So this is from Poland, and I can take one more feedback, and then I will give you, Karolina, the floor to close, because I have to run for my teaching activities.
Vilde
so
and
please,
Sarah.
Vilde, Sarah, and then Karolina.
Yes, when it comes to integration programs, the Nordic countries in general have, generally very extensive integration programs for those who get protection. And as I presented shortly in my presentation, in Norway and Denmark, you were entitled as a forced migrant from Ukraine also to be part of these introduction programs and rights to language training, etc. But in Sweden, in the initial period, you are not. So here you see a clear difference between the different countries if you have fewer rights as a forced migrant from Ukraine, or the similar rights to, or modified rights at least. Yeah.
And Sarah?
Yes, I just wanted to say that what we've learned during the whole process is that these questions are incredibly complex, because the social welfare systems and the contexts are so different. So looking at the integration question as such would require a total new project with more funding and more money to examine, for us to be able to say something specifically on that in different national contexts.
Nora, Oksana, do you want to add something?
If not, I think
on the
that
question of education,
Yeah,
or not really. In Germany, you had different ways of dealing with it. Like education in particular is down to the subnational level. So the regions dealt with it differently. And the two main models were that either kids were mainstreamed in the normal classes, where the feedback has been it's been too challenging, or they were separated into specific classes more on language learning, and then it's been an issue of segregation and too simple because it was just the focus on language. So both models didn't fully work out, but there are studies from other colleagues who look at that in more detail. We haven't touched upon education so much.
Okay, so I think I don't know if anybody have any last words or last questions. If not, so I would like to very much thank everyone for coming, for taking your time to talk about your research, and for all our listeners to stay with us during the presentation. It was, I think, extremely interesting and helpful. And I'm looking forward for our future cooperations and research and discussions. Thank you very much.